there. Why did you post those views to YouTube in the first place?
Well, there's proximate and distal reasons. The proximate reasons was because I received some correspondence from clients of mine who had been, I would say, persecuted in a variety of ways by people who were politically correct, and they sent me some documentation about Bill C-16 and the associated policy statements on the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which I read and was not very happy about. And also because the University of Toronto decided to make anti-racism and anti-bias training, so-called anti-racism and anti-bias training, mandatory, which I regarded as an inappropriate incursion into the domain of political opinion by the university administration.
Have you taken that training yet?
No, and I don't have to yet. It's the HR department personnel that have to take it.
If they decide that you have to, will you?
No way. Not a chance.
Okay. And what's the other, you referred to persecution that friends or clients of yours had experienced, such as?
Yeah, well, there are lots of places now where the workplace has become, I would say, excessively politicized, and so people who have viewpoints, and this also includes, I would say, fairly radical leftist viewpoints, people don't feel comfortable at all in being able to use the language of their choice or to have even opinions about a variety of different things. And so, and I've had 3 clients who I would say have been, we'll say, harassed, I suppose is the right way of putting it.
On social media or otherwise?
No, at work, by people who don't like their political opinions, essentially.
And the opinions were what?
Well, I can't tell you too much about it, actually, because of issues, fundamentally issues of confidentiality.
Essentially, I guess what I'm asking is to lay the case out. What is it you find offensive about this legislation?
Well, fundamentally, there were 2 things that really bothered me, although there have been other things I've thought about since. One was that I was being asked, as everyone is, to use a certain set of words that I think are the constructions of people who have a political ideology that I don't believe in and that I also regard as dangerous.
What are those words?
Those are the made-up words that people now describe as gender neutral. And so, to me, they're an attempt to control language and in a direction that isn't happening organically. It's not happening naturally. People aren't picking up these words in the typical way that new words are picked up, but by force and by fiat. And I would say by force because there's legislative power behind them. So and I don't like these made-up words, Z and Zer and that sort of thing.
Okay, what about, they're not all made-up, quote-unquote made-up words. For example, they is one of them. Yeah, to speak to an individual as they.
Right, but we can't dispense with the distinction between singular and plural. I mean, I know that the advocates of that particular approach say that they has been used forever as a singular, and that's actually not correct. It's used as a singular in very exceptional circumstances, like if your child wishes to bring a book to school, they're welcome to do so. But
that's just grammatically incorrect.
Well, it is also, there's some debate about that because they is used like that sometimes, but it's never been used as a singular replacement for he or she. And so it's not a tenable solution, and that's the best of the solutions.
So we understand your views and where you're coming from. You decided to lay these views out in some YouTube discourses.
Yes.
You put them up. The response has been overwhelming. Did you anticipate that you would get this kind of feedback?
No, there was no way of anticipating this. And I think you mentioned in the intro, that this is a consequence of what I've done. And I don't think that's true. It's a consequence of the fact. I thought about it, and I think the right metaphor is that, there's a large forest, and it's been a hot, dry summer, or maybe a drought, and there's plenty of dead wood gathered. And I lit a spark, and you can't blame the forest fire on the spark. And, it's just not possible for someone to put up a YouTube video and cause this kind of brouhaha without all of the groundwork already being laid.
Fair enough. There is clearly there is out there an appetite against political correctness, which is what you have described this as. In fact, your YouTube video is called Professor Against Political Correctness. But let's make sure we're all speaking the same language here. You would define that how? Political correctness.
Well, I think it's a particular kind of ideological game, and I think the outcome is twofold. It's to make the player feel morally superior and also to take rather serious axe swings at the foundation of society. And so the game is identify a domain of human endeavor, note that there's a distribution of success. Some people are doing comparatively better and some people are doing comparatively worse. Define those doing worse as victims. define those doing better as perpetrators, identify with the victims, have yourself a set of enemies handy to vent your resentment on, feel good about it even though it didn't really require any work on your part, and then endlessly repeat. And that's why I've seen that happening on campuses in particular for the last 30 years.
In your YouTube talk, you describe those who oppose you on this issue as, quote, resentful and uninformed.
Yes.
Tell me why you think that's accurate.
Well, I worked for the NDP when I was a kid. From the time I was 14 to the time I was 18, I worked with Rachel Notley's father and her mother and knew them very well. And I actually found them very admirable people, as well as the other people on the socialist end of the distribution who were genuinely working for the rights of working class people, coming out of that Saskatchewan tradition that established health care and pension and all of that. But I noted at the same time that the party functionaries, let's say, weren't that sort of person at all. They didn't really like the working class. They weren't standing up for them. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it until I read George Orwell's Road to Whig and Peer, which is a brilliant book, and which was written for the Left Book Club in the UK. And he was talking about the failures of socialism in the United Kingdom, and then discussed intellectual socialists of the type who didn't exactly like the poor. Okay. They just hated the rich.
Resentful and uninformed, though.
Yes, well, the resentful part is the willingness to pull down any structure that's hierarchical because of resentment about not being on the top. And uninformed is, well, it's the consistent attempt to force every political issue into the domain encompassed and viewed through this single lens.
Jordan, let's do one more question here, and then we'll get everybody else into the conversation. You know, of course, that since this story broke, you've been called a lot of things.
Yeah.
One of which is a transphobe.
Yeah.
Some people have accused you of using the free speech issue to mask what's really going on here, which is an attempt to deprive other people of what they believe are their legitimate rights. Well, and I want to give you the opportunity to speak to whether or not you are a transphobe.
Well, I can tell you that I've received more letters from transsexual people supporting me than opposing me. And I never said anything really about transsexual people, about their existence, although that was the first thing that I was accused of doing. I didn't say that transsexual people didn't exist. I said that gender identity, gender expression, and biological sex do not vary independently, which they don't. And so this issue is in some sense only peripherally about transsexual issues. It's more centrally about gender issues. And then on top of that, and I think it's the biggest issue, is that it's a free speech issue.
Okay, let us continue to explore all of those issues that you have just raised. And why don't we do this? Let's take a moment. We're going to explain a few basic things here. The issue of so-called non-traditional pronouns goes together with non-traditional gender identities. New York City, for example, recognizes 31 such gender expressions. In other words, besides man and woman, there are 29 other gender expressions. For example, pangender, queer gender, gender fluid, cross-dresser, bigendered, gender blender, and the list goes on. And Nicholas, this is where I want to bring you into the discussion because you teach this. You teach trans studies. So if you would, give us a brief primer on so many gender identities that, in your view, require non-traditional pronouns.
Basically, it's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex. And I'm a historian of medicine. I can unpack that for you at great length if you want, but in the interest of time, I won't. So that's a very popular misconception. So essentially, when in my transgender studies classes, what we're doing is looking at actual research and identifying ways that current social issues related to trans people or things that are associated with trans, such as free speech arguments and claims, how that connects to the way that people are thinking, the way that research has been framed, the histories.
Give us some of the other pronouns that one would hear, typically.
I don't focus on pronouns because pronouns are actually part of a cisnormative culture. So what we do is learn about...
Well, I'm going to stop you right there.
Yeah, I was just about to explain.
Good.
So we don't start from a cisnormative perspective because that can't actually go very far.
What does cisnormative mean?
So I'm going to start us there. Cisnormative is basically the very popular idea and assumption that most people probably have, and definitely that our structures convey, that there is such a thing as male and female, that they connect to being a girl or a boy or a man or a woman, and then sometimes that will also recognize intersex or trans people or transsexual people, as you mentioned, because that's sometimes also referred to as a gender binary. So anything that fits within a gender binary can work within cisnormativity. Okay. But cisnormativity is basically that everyone assumes that there is male and female, and so very little is actually looked at to understand what's actually the case. And scientists have been doing this for
Because
at
your
least
view
over
would be
50 years.
your view would be it's much more complicated than that.
Right, it's not my view. I just know that for over 50 years, scientists have shown that that's not true, and yet our social systems haven't been able to find a way to address the level of complexity that people actually experience.
Can I step in, Steve?
Stand by for a second, because I want to let everybody else get in first,
And I
then
didn't
we'll get you in.
interrupt you either, so.
Mary, how prevalent is transgenderism in our world?
I don't think I can. I don't think I can answer that question. I think that I would agree with Nicholas that there is some discrepancy on these numbers, and there is some variance on the numbers. I guess I'm curious as to why we need to put a number on this, because that's come up. I listened to Jordan's video. And that was something that was mentioned. You know, this is statistically, you know, there are so few intersex people as to be, it's insignificant.
Well, I think there's a reasonable curiosity as to whether or not we're talking about half the population or less than 1% of the population. That's all.
No, I understand that. I guess what I'm saying is it seems that there's a focus on that in terms of what we know now, and I think what Nicholas is trying to say, and I don't want to presume too much. I think that number is going to be something that evolves as we evolve and our language evolves, and we give people the room to come forward and express who they are.
Okay, let me, as part of that expression and evolution of this issue, the use of non-traditional pronouns. Where are you on that?
I think people should be able to say how they want to be addressed. I do believe that. In my own experience in writing the Walrus piece, you know, I began at one place and ended at another, and I'll let everyone pay their $7 to find out how they can buy the magazine. But I think that for me, you know, identifying as male at a very late stage in my life, I didn't have a lot of attachment to the pronoun she. You could have said giraffe. I had found a way at a very early age not to even hear that word. It meant nothing to me. So I didn't dive into the pronoun he.
So if I were going to refer to you, though, in the third person, you would want me to call you they?
Yes.
Okay, because that encapsulates what?
I think it reflects where I am right now. I because of my lived experience, you know, 5 decades as being identified, certainly by the world as female, some of the time, not all of the time, my lived experience was largely female. And I personally am not sort of ready to jump in wholly into having people call me he, but I'm certainly far enough along in terms of, you know, how I feel internally that I don't want to be called she.
Understood. Let's go to British Columbia. Theron, I want you to help us understand, for our viewers who don't know you and don't know your work, I would like you to describe yourself.
Well, I make political commentary mostly on YouTube, and I mostly focus on basically countering with my own personal perspectives, countering what I consider to be the kind of hegemony surrounding the political hegemony surrounding trans politics, and what I consider to be quite ridiculous opinions and demands coming from what has come to be known as kind of the political trans lobby.
I'm not as good at this issue as I should be, so I'm going to look to you to help me use the right words here to describe how you were born and what you see yourself as now. So is it accurate to say you're a trans woman?
Yes, I wish I lived in a world where that was just obvious and I don't have to explain that to people, but apparently I do. I mean, yes, I'm just a woman.
Is this to say you were born male but now are female?
Yes, I transitioned from male to female.
In which case, do I refer to you, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Mary, which is, do I refer to you as her or she now?
Yes, you do.
I do, okay. And how do you relate to the experiences that we have heard arise during this debate where gender identities and pronouns are up for grabs, if you like?
I'm very skeptical of the ideology surrounding gender identity. I don't believe there are 29 plus gender identities or genders. I believe there's male and female, and then there's somewhere in between, and most people fall along that. And just people who are in between does not constitute a new gender. There are two genders, period. And that is biologically a sound argument to make, just because the argument that was made earlier in the show is that, or it wasn't an argument, but a claim that there is no such thing as biological sex. Well, that's simply not true. It is true that there are multiple characteristics and there are multiple factors that go into determining sex, and that sex is not an on-off switch, that there is a spectrum to it, just like with most things in nature. Most things aren't an on-off switch. Most things develop like on a spectrum. But for the most part, the vast majority of people fall either on the male side or on the female side. And yes, it's true that scientists, that doctors have and researchers have been finding more and more factors that go into not only determining genetic sex, but determining the expression of those genes. So it's truly a fascinating, complex field of study, but that does not mean that there is no such thing as biological sex.
Okay.
When it comes to the issue of pronouns, would you like me to
Yeah,
give my
briefly,
opinion on
briefly, if you would, because Kyle has been the most patient person in the world waiting for his chance to get in. So yes, you finish your statement, and then I'm going to get to Kyle.
Okay, my apologies. Well, firstly, I have a lot of sympathy for people who want to be referred to by their pronouns. Obviously, as a trans woman, I know what it feels like to be misgendered and whatnot. And most people are reasonable in the sense that they would be reasonable enough to accommodate trans people and their preferred pronouns. And I'm sure, I mean, I would hope that if I were a student of Dr. Peterson, that he would refer to me as she and wouldn't have a problem with that. But at the end of the day, you know, a personal pronoun preference still is a preference for what language other people use. And at the end of the day, I don't have ultimate control over what Dr. Peterson, what the language he chooses to use, or anybody else for that matters. That's up to them.
Okay, let me find out then.
The problem arises.
Let me find out. If she were a student of yours, what would you call her?
She.
You would. Okay. We've established that. Theron, stand by for a second now. I do want, thank you for your patience, Professor Kirkup, and I want to bring you in now because, as I suggested earlier, in New York City, they have identified 31 gender identities, and apparently the law down there suggests that if businesses don't accommodate an individual's chosen gender identity, there is the risk of a six-figure fine under the rules of the city's Commissioner of Human Rights. We have, in the province of Ontario, our own Ontario Human Rights Commission, and I wonder how similar our legislation is here on this issue compared to what they have in New York City.
So where I would start the discussion is to actually point that, you know, even though we're talking about adding gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act and provisions of the Criminal Code, this is a long-standing practice in Canadian human rights jurisprudence. You can go back into the late 1990s, and the cases that we're seeing in the tribunals are not the kind of extreme examples of a number of different kinds of gender pronouns. What we're seeing is really more basic human rights questions. So questions like, are you required to undergo surgery in order to have an identity document that properly captures who you are as a person? Discrimination in policing contexts, discrimination in the workplace. And so I think the pronoun issue is really a red herring. When you look through the jurisprudence dating back to the 1990s, we're seeing much more fundamental questions, really basic human rights questions that are coming before the tribunals. And having reviewed the case law, I'm not seeing the kind of New York scenario that you're proposing at all.
Well, let me read some of the Ontario Human Rights Code to you, and then I'll get your feedback on that. Discrimination, the Human Rights Code says, happens when a person experiences negative treatment or impact, intentional or not, because of their gender identity or gender expression. It can be direct and obvious or subtle and hidden, but harmful just the same. It can also happen on a bigger systemic level, such as organizational rules or policies that look neutral but end up excluding trans people. Organizations are liable for any discrimination and harassment that happens. They are also liable for not accommodating a trans person's needs unless it would cause undue hardship. And again, Kyle, I'll get you to follow up on that, in as much as if a trans person or somebody whose gender identity was more, shall we say, complicated than the male-female that we've been talking about so far, and the pronoun used to describe that person were not traditional, would the person have a case before the Human Rights Commission?
So we haven't seen cases on that at this point, but I would say absolutely as a general rule that you should be thinking about in terms of employment settings, absolutely respecting trans persons' pronoun choice is really fundamental. And I can also say that in lots of circumstances, a pronoun may not even be required. There are lots of creative ways to avoid using gendered pronouns at all. And so I think that but when you actually look at the cases that are coming before tribunals, we're not seeing that to be really the primary issue. It's much more basic human rights questions, which is what the federal legislation here, Bill C-16, tries to accomplish.
All right, I think we've set the table now. You want to get in on this now, I can tell. You've heard what the professor has to say. What's your response?
Well, I don't understand what the claim that there's no such thing as biological sex means, and I certainly think it's, let's call it an error, to suggest that there's some sort of scientific consensus about that. I mean, there's biological differences between males and females in animals and human beings at every level of analysis.
Okay, I'm jumping in here, because what about the notion he put forward at the end there, that if you do not refer to people with the pronoun that they prefer to be referred to, that is a form, according to the Human Rights Commission, of discrimination.
It's not just a form of discrimination, it's a form of hate speech. That's why I made the video. I said that we were in danger of placing the refusal to use certain kinds of language into the same category as Holocaust denial, and suggested that maybe that wasn't such a good idea, especially since there's plenty of debate to be had about gender issues in our society, which I also think are also in danger of becoming illegal, and quite rapidly. So it isn't clear to me how long we'll be able to have the talk that we're having right now.
Here are
Can
some.
I jump in there? Can I jump in there on?
Please.
I think it's a common misconception about Bill C-16 that it's somehow going to make pronoun use into hate speech. If you actually look at the provisions, we're talking about very minor amendments to the criminal code. For example,
they're not minor.
section,
They put it into the hate speech category. They're not minor at all. That's a misstatement.
I agree with you on that point. I think
So
there's
don't
a lot
tell
of
me they're
opportunity
minor.
here.
That's not
There's
right.
a lot of opportunity.
So section.
opening.
Kyle,
Yeah,
go
so
ahead.
Section 318, pardon me, so Section 318 sets out a series of identifiable groups, and we're talking about the clearest of cases, the cases of advocating genocide. And we have a series of groups that are already identified in the code, and all this does is add gender identity and gender expression to the categories that are already identified. And so I think we really have to add some reasonableness to this discussion, actually clearly articulate what the provision does.
Well, let me be a little clear about what some of the problems, what you might be asking for if you want to do this. For example, and Sheldon, bottom of page 3 here, let's put this graphic up. Pronoun misuse may become actionable through the human rights tribunals and the courts, and the remedies: monetary damages, non-financial remedies, for example, ceasing the discriminatory practice or reinstatement to the job, and public interest remedies, for example, changing hiring practices or developing non-discriminatory policies and procedures. Jail time is not one of them. Jordan, you're not going to go to jail if you keep this up. Do you find that reassuring?
What if I don't pay the fine?
Then what?
Then what? And let's talk about the legalities for a minute. As you know, the University of Toronto sent me 2 warning letters, right? And the second one basically asked me to stop talking about this.
Who sent the letters?
The first, it's the administration, fundamentally, the higher up people in the administration. The last one was the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science. But, you know, it's coming from the top end of the university.
And the letter said essentially you must call people by the pronouns they want?
The letters basically said that, and this is paraphrasing obviously, that as I'm required to abide by the university policies and the Ontario Human Rights Code, and there's a strong implication in the letter by having this discussion that I wasn't doing so, and so they're asking me to stop. And I can tell you also why they're asking me to stop apart from that. The codes as written make the university just as liable for my speech as I am. So not only is there a reasonable possibility that what I'm doing is uttering hate speech now under our law, but the university is legally responsible for that. And so I think they consulted with their lawyers and decided that maybe the claim that I was making in my video was correct. So I don't regard that as trivial, and I think that the lawyer who's discussing this is downplaying the significance of it tremendously.
Could I speak to the campus climate about this? Because I don't agree with why Dr. Peterson has been asked to stop abusing students on campus.
To stop doing what?
Abusing students.
I see.
And other members of our learning community who do deserve respect and do deserve to be able to work and learn and contribute to society in a place where if they are physically assaulted, if they are...
The assault so far came from the social justice warriors who are at this free speech rally, and almost 2 million people have watched those so far.
This is not accurate.
Well, you can look at the videos yourself.
Because people have been making complaints about your behavior.
Yes, I understand that.
Yes. And so we're seeing a greater opportunity for social justice happening that many people won't understand.
Nick, can I be clear on something? You've accused him of abusing students by not using the pronouns they want to be addressed by.
That's how I see it, absolutely.
That is tantamount to abuse in your view.
Absolutely. Many, many global documents, many organizations.
How about violence? Is it tantamount to violence?
Yes,
How about hate speech? Is it tantamount to hate speech?
Yes, of course. It's hate speech to tell someone that you won't refer to them as in a way that they that recognizes their humanity and dignity.
Mary, let me get you in on this at this point.
Sure.
You got something you want to say, or can I put a question to you?
Both. Go ahead.
Okay.
For the question.
You're a writer, Mary.
I am.
I know you care about free speech because you're a writer.
Yes.
Does Jordan Peterson have a little place in your heart because he's arguing free speech here?
I think the interesting thing about Jordan and how I feel about his video, and Jordan and I actually had an opportunity to talk at length before I wrote the Walrus article, and he sails really close to things that I think people can relate to. And I think that we all want to have, an open discourse. We want conversations to unfold. We want people to feel like if they have something to say, if they have a question, they can ask it, that they're not going to be censored. But he sails really close and then right past it, and that's where he and I part ways. Because what I don't really understand is when you listen to the video, he piles a lot of things into the basket of using the pronouns that people want. And it seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of his anxieties, and he talks about being fearful and anxious in his video, that somehow there's a cabal of trans activists who have so much power that they are going to basically, using the pronouns that people want and capitulating to these demands, sort of pulls out the Jenga, the critical Jenga piece of the Western canon, right? I mean, basically, Jordan is arguing that this is going to create chaos and anarchy, and that it's essentially a Marxist plot that is there to sow violence and there to sow confusion and topple any kind of hierarchy.
Can I just jump in there for a second? Is that an accurate characterization of your view on this?
I listened really closely to that tape.
Okay.
I think it is.
Is it, in your view, has she accurately characterized where you're coming from?
It's not a transsexual cabal by any stretch of the imagination. Is it a cabal of radical left-wingers? Yes, it's a cabal of radical left-wingers, and they've been active behind and in front of the scenes increasingly over the last 30 years. And my estimation is that departments like Women's Studies have trained between 300,000 and 3 million radical left-wing activists, and they're making...
And they're all underpaid, so don't worry.
Well, they could pick higher-paying occupations if they wanted higher-paying occupations, but...
Because sexism does not exist. Are you kidding me?
Let's not get off topic here, folks.
I
Go
think
ahead, Mary.